Reminder, doctor, you're still under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. Fowler, right before the break, we were discussing Mr. Floyd's heart and the contributions of Mr. Floyd's heart to his death. Did you form, in your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what you thought was the principal cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes.
And what is that?
Cardiac arrhythmia due to hypertensive, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease during restraint.
Now, in terms of the other contributing factors to Mr. Floyd's death, did you, as a part of your review, make other considerations to things that may have contributed?
Yes, I did.
I'd like to discuss with you carbon monoxide, or CO. Okay. You've reviewed all of the videos in the case, correct?
I did.
Did you pay attention to where Mr. Floyd's head was positioned relevant to the squad car?
Yes, I did.
Which way was his face, nose, mouth facing?
His face was facing towards the vehicle, towards the rear of the vehicle, and directly towards the area where you would expect the tailpipe or tailpipes of a vehicle to be.
And let me just ask you, are you suggesting that Mr. Floyd died from carbon monoxide poisoning?
Absolutely not, no. Not a full carbon monoxide poisoning, no.
All right. Now, I'd like to, if the court could publish, and before the court does, the next slide has a screenshot from Officer King's body-worn camera at 20:24:09. Do you see that in front of you there?
I do not at this time, no.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, I have independently marked this single slide as Exhibit 1058. And based upon discussions with counsel, I'd move for its admission.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
1058 is received.
Permission to publish? All right. Dr. Fowler, based on your review of the videos and evidence, were you able to determine if the vehicle was running?
There was evidence that the vehicle was running.
What would that evidence consist of?
What I observed was a collection of fluid. I don't know if this is working. Maybe I'm doing the wrong way. Collection of fluid.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Sure.
Back on.
Objections overruled.
Dr. Fowler, based on your general knowledge as a forensic pathologist, your personal experiences, what comes out of a car's exhaust?
Typically, we see the products of combustion. It's an internal combustion engine coming out the exhaust. And the major products of combustion are going to be water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and then a couple of other very small other particulate and minor gases that come out of the exhaust pipe.
Is carbon monoxide toxic?
It is an extremely toxic gas.
How does it act as a poison?
Carbon monoxide attaches to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, and it attaches to those red blood cells more tightly than oxygen. So it competes for the same binding position on the hemoglobin that oxygen does. And since it is a better, and it binds more firmly, the oxygen can't displace it. So as the percentage of carbon monoxide bound to your hemoglobin in your bloodstream slowly goes up, you lose that portion of your oxygen carrying capacity. So if you have a 10% carbon monoxide saturation in your bloodstream, you've lost 10% of your oxygen carrying capacity.
Okay. Can that cause ultimately death?
When you get to levels way in excess of 50, 60%, people typically, even young, healthy individuals, will start to die. The issue is that people with significant heart disease and reduced capacity in their heart are going to be adversely affected earlier. And so there are certainly many examples in the literature of people dying in an environment where multiple people are exposed, but one person dies at, and I've seen this, less than 20%, and the others die at varying levels above that. So it's not universal that everybody will require to get to 60, 70, 80%. That's a young, healthy individual. But people with predisposing conditions who are vulnerable will die at much lower levels.
So in terms of the literature, are you familiar generally with the literature on carbon monoxide poisoning?
Yes.
Specifically, are you familiar with the paper by DeMaio and Dana on carbon monoxide poisoning in open spaces?
Yes, that is a paper that came out in the late 80s, I believe.
And is this here as a part of your PowerPoint, that article, or the title of that article?
Yeah, this is the title sheet or title portion of that particular paper that was published by the two doctors, yes.
And that was in the late 80s, you said?
Correct.
Are you familiar with CDC warnings on carbon monoxide in open spaces?
Yes.
Can you describe what this slide represents?
So this is the outdoor air recommendations. So we're talking about indoor air, outdoor air recommendations by the EPA, and recommending that individuals are not exposed to more than 9 parts per million for 8 hours. Anything above an 8-hour exposure puts you at risk of absorbing carbon monoxide, which can put you at risk of at least symptoms, if not more. And when you go up to 35 parts per million, so not much of an increase, that exposure limit drops to 1 hour.
So in terms of the CDC versus the EPA, what does the CDC say?
Well, they're both saying, just be careful of carbon monoxide, regardless of your environment.
Are you familiar with the Consumer Product Safety Commission scale? Excuse me, the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Yes.
Is that the information that you obtained for this case?
So this is the top of the page
Okay.
that they refer to, and if you go to the next slide, it actually says what it says on the page. And basically they're saying that most people will not experience any symptoms from a prolonged exposure to carbon monoxide between 1 and 70 parts per million. But some heart patients may experience an increase in chest pain. In other words, become symptomatic in that range. As CO levels increase and remain above 70 parts per million, symptoms become more noticeable and include headache, fatigue, and nausea. And once you get above 150 to 200 parts per million, people become disoriented, unconscious, and death are possible. So the higher the level, the more rapid and the more serious the potential consequences of exposure to a source of carbon monoxide is.
Are you also familiar with the World Health Organization standards?
Yes.
Is that the next slide?
So this is just, again, the header from their document. The relevant information is on the next slide. And they go a little further than the EPA, giving us more data. And what they do is they've got the same 9 parts per million for 8 hours. their recommendation is not more than 26 parts per million for 8 hours, not the 35 that the CDC, the EPA has. At 52 parts per million, the risk of exposure issues occurs you get in 30 minutes at 52 parts per million, which is in that 1 to 70 range that the EPA said is okay. And then at 87 parts per million, 15 minutes is all it takes to start getting yourself into having absorbed a decent amount of carbon monoxide.
Now, you're not a mechanic, correct?
No.
All right. But are you aware of some just sort of general standards in terms of the emission of carbon monoxide by vehicles?
Yes, I am. It's part of the general knowledge that forensic pathologists have as to the different types of sources of carbon monoxide.
And would that include the California Air Resources Board?
Yes, this is one of the most strict automobile emission regulations.
And what does the regulations stand for?
So in California, and it's been adopted in about 14, 15 states around the country, so California has been copied by various other states. Some states have not copied it. I could not find any reference to Minnesota being a CARB state.
Okay.
So, but adopting the California stringent regulations, a vehicle may emit up to 1,200 parts per million of carbon monoxide from its exhaust.
And I'm going back to the prior slide, where would that fall within the World Health Organization guidelines?
Well, they go up to 87, we're talking 1,200, so we're talking in excess of 10 times. 12,
Now-
13 times.
Now, again, you're not suggesting to the jury that Mr. Floyd died of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Not exclusively, no.
How would you be able to determine the role that carbon monoxide played in a particular death?
Typically, and the easiest way for a medical examiner to do that is to have the blood tested by a laboratory for what we call carboxyhemoglobin saturation. And it will come back from the laboratory giving us a percentage saturation.
To your knowledge, was Mr. Floyd's blood tested for carbon monoxide?
I could not find a reference to it now.
Now, the previous articles that we kind of looked at, the DeMaio, I think you said, from the late 80s, are there more recent studies on the effect of carbon monoxide exposure in open spaces?
Yes.
Is that this, oops,
Yeah.
no. May have gotten mixed in here.
I don't think I put this into the PowerPoint,
Oh, okay.
Mr. Nelson.
All
Yes,
right.
there's a recent study or case report that came out of Poland, where a taxi driver committed suicide by taking his vehicle, parking it in an open space, taking one of the mats out of the vehicle, putting it behind the vehicle, and then lay down on the mat and inhaled the exhaust. And he ended up with a very high level of carbon monoxide. It was in the 80s. Certainly sufficient to be an exclusive cause of death in that particular case. The interesting thing about that particular study was it provided no new information as carbon dioxide is dangerous. Carbon dioxide comes out of exhausts, and you can do this because it replicated what DeMaio and Dana had done 20, 30 years before. But what was done in that particular case was that the authorities tested the amount of carbon monoxide coming out of the exhaust. So they did a recreation, reenactment, and took carbon monoxide sensors and put them at approximately the place where the man's nose and mouth were, and then monitored the carbon monoxide coming out of this vehicle. So the principle that you can test a vehicle and make a determination exactly how dangerous it is was properly tested in that particular case. And they found that when the breeze was blowing or the wind was blowing at or about this man's face, and he was about a foot away, to give you a reference, When the wind was blowing, the amount of carbon monoxide picked up by the sensor was 200 parts per million. And when the wind dropped, it went up to 790 parts per million, which is, again, almost 10 times the World Health Organization's recommendation. So in the area close to an exhaust, you're going to have a much higher level of carbon monoxide than you would if you're 3-4 feet away.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, were similar experiments done in this case, or recreations?
I did not see any information that indicated that a similar recreation or was done in this particular case, no.
In terms of modern vehicles, they have catalytic converters, correct?
Absolutely.
And what does a catalytic converter do relevant to carbon monoxide?
It reduces it dramatically. So in the era before catalytic converters, the amount of carbon monoxide coming out of a typical car exhaust would exceed 30,000 parts per million and could be as high as 70,000 parts per million. So the catalytic converter and the modern emissions controls that you see on, at least in the California requirements, which are again the most strict, have reduced it by about 30 times to somewhere close to 1,000 to 1,200.
Now, in terms of, can you describe for the jury what a pulse oximeter is?
Yes, a pulse oximeter is a device that you put on the finger. It's a little clamp that you put on the finger, and it reads two things: your pulse rate and the oxygen saturation in your blood. So it counts the pulses, and it reads how much oxygen you're carrying in your blood by looking at the color of your fingernail.
How does carbon monoxide come into play in terms of pulse oximeter?
So the important thing is it appears to be oxygen. It changes the blood to a color which the pulse oximeter thinks is oxygen. So if you take somebody who has 50% saturation with carbon monoxide, it will still read that the person is 95% oxygen. It doesn't tell you that there's 50%. So if a pulse oximeter was put on Mr. Floyd's finger in the vehicle and again in the hospital, the pulse oximeter does not give us any information allowing us to say he was or was not under the influence of some degree of carbon monoxide intoxication.
How long does carbon monoxide typically stay in the bloodstream?
So it stays in the bloodstream. If you want to treat a person and put them on 100% oxygen, the half-life is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. If you're exposed to ambient air, it takes much longer to get rid of the carbon monoxide.
And so, I mean, essentially removing that carbon monoxide from the bloodstream is a reversible process.
It's not an irreversible blonde, it is reversible. So yes, it will at some point slowly dissociate and be blown off. We do generate a small degree of carbon monoxide as part of our normal metabolism. It's a very low, sub 1%, and it binds to the oxygen, to the hemoglobin, and eventually dissociates and is eliminated. So in small amounts are not an issue, and yes, it will dissociate and be blown off at some point as part of the normal metabolism.
So how much carbon monoxide is needed to be absorbed into the bloodstream to diminish the oxygen supply?
Well, for a young, healthy individual, you want to probably exceed the 60, 70, 80% range. That's what we typically see. However, in individuals who have risk factors, that can be far, far less.
What type of risk factors would you look for?
So these are particularly, the individuals that are particularly at risk are people with cardiovascular disease, as we saw in Mr. Floyd, and people with chronic obstructive lung disease would also have a higher risk, and then other comorbidities, kidney disease, etc. But the real high-risk one is going to be heart.
And what percentage would you expect when someone presents with those conditions?
Very difficult to predict because everybody is different. There are studies out there where as little as 6% saturation with carbon monoxide in an individual who's exercising with heart disease will start causing arrhythmias. So it's a very low percentage. Now you have to have all of this, the heart disease and exercise, but at about 6%, there have been studies done in a controlled laboratory environment where people started showing EKG changes and premature ventricular contractions at about 6%. So it has potential to affect individuals at much lower levels than you would require for a young, healthy individual.
Now, in terms of findings at autopsy, are there certain things at autopsy that can determine the what the presence of carbon monoxide, or certain observations the physician, the pathologist can make?
Yes, typically carbon monoxide makes the blood appear, and the terminology, it looks like it's cherry red in color. It's not the standard pink or slightly darker red color that we would see for deoxygenated blood. It's a fairly bright cherry red color. Hence the reason the pulse oximeters get somewhat confused as well. Now, when you get levels of 50, 60, 70%, and the greater majority of the blood is carboxyhemoglobin, it stands out. But when you're looking at levels that are 10%, 20%, it doesn't, and is not easy to see. A typical smoker, 1 pack a day, will have and can have a carboxyhemoglobin of 6%. 2 packs a day, you can get up to 12%. We just don't see that as forensic pathologists because there is so much background color from the normal blood that it's lost in that. So I would expect a pathologist, when there is substantial amount, to spot it relatively easily, but I would not expect somebody to see the lower levels that can still be a factor.
And to do that, you would need to test the blood?
That would be the gold standard, yes. Test the blood and see how much carboxyhemoglobin is in the blood.
So if you're not saying that carbon monoxide caused Mr. Floyd's death, can you likewise eliminate it as a contributing factor?
The only way to eliminate carbon monoxide as a contributing factor would be to ensure that there was none in his blood or a very, very low level in his blood. So in Mr. Floyd, it robs him of an additional percentage of oxygen carrying capacity, whether that be 5%, 10%, 15%. It takes away from the important factor of getting blood to his heart muscle. So this is just another potential insult, another brick in the wall, unfortunately, for the circumstances here.
Now, ultimately, the officers weren't affected by this.
No, they were not.
And why could that be?
Well, they're another 2 to 3 feet away, and potentially, hopefully, they're much younger, and hopefully don't have heart disease. So with every foot or more away, the amount of carbon monoxide in that particular bubble is going to decrease.
Now, so we've discussed the heart, we've discussed carbon monoxide. Did you eliminate certain causes of death as well?
Yes,
Specifically referring to asphyxia.
correct.
How would you describe the investigation of custodial deaths compared to other types of deaths?
Very long, very complex, and something that needs to be done very, very carefully.
Are there many variables to consider?
Absolutely, there are a huge number of variables, as we obviously can see in the case of Mr. Floyd as well.
Now, in terms of this article here in your PowerPoint presentation, what's the significance of this?
So this is an article that was put out, I think about 1992 by Dr. James Luke and Dr. Donald Ray. Dr. Donald Ray was one of the first pathologists to theorize that putting somebody in a face-down position was dangerous. And this was based on observations of cases where people were placed in a prone position and they died. And so his conclusion was that may well be a factor and needed to be considered. But what Dr. Ray also does say, and later on he recanted that to a large extent, but what he does say is that these are very difficult, complex cases. Don't rush to judgment. Make sure you've considered all of the potential issues that are at play in these particular cases. And they even talk about a crystal ball in this particular case, and the risk of underestimating the importance of common sense, and the fact that there are no easy answers in such deaths.
In your experiences as a forensic pathologist, have you had the opportunity to perform a death investigation and autopsies of in-custody deaths?
Yes.
So in this particular case, we've heard a lot about hypoxia. Which organ is more sensitive to hypoxia?
The brain is the most sensitive, or rapidly sensitive, to hypoxia.
In your review of the materials, did you have an opportunity to review some testimony of Dr. Baker in prior proceedings?
Yes.
Dr. Baker, in his testimony, referenced some studies in terms of the effects of positional asphyxia. Are you familiar with those studies?
Yes.
Did you take those studies into consideration as far as your analysis of this case?
Yes, that is the current state of the science or the knowledge base with regard to this very difficult situation.
So let's talk just simply about the prone position. Do people sometimes sleep in the prone position?
Yes, approximately 7% of the adult population sleep face down.
In terms of medical examinations, treatments, are people kept in the prone position?
In certain situations, people are examined in the prone position. There are therapeutic maneuvers where people are deliberately placed in the prone position. One of the best examples right now is COVID, where patients will be put in a prone position, which is face down, and it improves their ability for oxygen exchange, not decreases it. So, the prone position by itself does not have, or at least there is no evidence right now that that is a significant issue.
In terms of this particular case, of course, the prone position is, not in a hospital setting, right? It's on a street, agreed?
Correct.
And just generally speaking, if a person were to lay down on the street in the prone position with nothing on top of them, is that in and of itself inherently dangerous?
No, the scientific studies basically have looked at the issue of the prone position with and without weight and made a determination that there really is no significant impairment of the individual's respiratory function. And those particular studies were very carefully crafted.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, Doctor. Can you just, what's the kind of the leading study on weight applied to someone in the prone position?
I think there are several, but the one that I've recently read, well, not recently, but I know of, is the one by Dr. Mark Kroll and a couple of other co-authors.
And is that paper here?
Yes, I believe that is the one, yes.
Positional compression and restraint asphyxia, a brief review?
Yes.
Now, in terms of this study, can you just explain this study? Can you explain the setting of the study, etc.?
So this is a review paper where he refers to various papers, including his own work, where no evidence of any kind of compressional asphyxia was found in individuals who were in the so-called hog-tie situation, which is prone with their hands handcuffed behind their backs, additional restraints applied around their ankles, and then the two tied together. That is the classical hog-tie position. And then weights were applied to the individual up to 102 kilograms, which is 225 pounds, and found, again, no significant disturbance to their ability to exchange and breathe. And so the final conclusion was, and there are about 23 different studies out there that Dr. Baker referred to in his previous testimonies and that previous legal environment. And in this paper, Dr. Kroll says, positional asphyxia, as the term is used in court today, is an interesting hypothesis, unsupported by any experimental data.
So let me ask you, pursuant to the court's order, you were permitted to review the testimony or watch the testimony of other expert witnesses in this case, correct?
Yes.
And did you do so?
Some of them, not all of them.
Okay. Did you hear criticism of this Kroll paper?
Yes, I did.
And do you think that the study was flawed based on its methodology?
So the study was asking one specific question. Is the prone position dangerous? When you craft a experimental process to look at a particular process, in this particular case was the prone, you want to eliminate all other variables. You want to eliminate fear. You want to eliminate exertion. You want to eliminate environmental conditions other than, and focus entirely on that one entity. So agree that what is happening in this particular situation, they didn't use people who had heart disease. They used young, healthy volunteers. The surface they were lying on was not asphalt. It was a hard floor with a thin gym mat on it. The individuals were not in fear of their life. They knew that they could be pulled out of that at any time, and so there was no fear and hypersecretion of adrenaline and all of the other issues. All they simply were doing is evaluating just the prone position and the weight on the back from the prone position, and found that it had no effect. So now you can go back and look at the other issues if you want to at some stage.
Now, in terms of this study, by putting weight on the back, how did that work?
So they were using bags of weight, sacks, and they continued to place them over the thorax, evenly distributed across the chest and an upper abdominal area. The area which is where your lungs and the so-called bellows, and so it puts pressure on the diaphragm because of the abdominal weight, and on the chest, and it looks to see whether or not individuals can still move air in and out, and they did not find any significant impact.
Have you ever seen an image of like a baseball team winning the World Series?
Oh, you mean a human pyramid?
Right.
Yes.
Is it kind of the analysis or analogy that they bring?
Yes.
Kind of lots of people piled up on top, someone's got to be at the bottom, right?
Correct.
Are there others, well, in terms of the Kroll studies, you talked about this particular study, or this particular paper, that was a review of other studies, right?
His own and other work, yes.
And there were 23, I believe you said?
That was the testimony that Dr. Baker
Okay.
stated in a previous legal proceeding.
So are these some of the other studies that they reviewed?
Yes, I mean, these are just a short list. It's not all of them. It's, again, just illustrative of the developing information. And really, this has gathered a lot of steam over the last couple of years. So prior to many of these studies, the wisdom of the position is dangerous was still accepted. But you can see from 2007, 2012, 2013, 2014, people are really beginning to look at this with a critical eye and really adding to the body of knowledge within the medical sciences and beginning to challenge some of these theories.
Now, in terms of, I mean, again, just the research, the criticism offered by previous experts was that it wasn't real world. Were some of these studies looking at real world situations?
Correct.
Which of those studies?
So the real world ones are the two papers by Dr. Hall, I think probably are the ones that stand out. The first paper was she took a city of 1.1 million. There weren't 1.1 million police restraints. It was a city of 1.1 million residents. And in that there were 1,296 cases where there was a forceful restraint. And the only death that they found in that particular case was a person who was not in the prone position. And they evaluated prone versus non-prone and statistically found no difference. That's a relatively small study. So they went on and did a bigger study where they took 4 cities and looked at almost 5,000 consecutive force events. And concluded, and their final conclusion was, concluded that their data support the human laboratory data, which are these ones that are in the controlled environment, that the prone position has no clinically significant effects on subject physiology.
Now, did Dr. Kroll also publish a paper relevant to the weight of a police officer?
Yes.
And is that this study here?
Yes.
And can you just describe for the jury this study by Dr. Kroll and others and the impact of an officer's weight being a factor in the analysis of prone position and positional asphyxia?
So basically, his conclusion was it doesn't matter how much the officer weighs. 140, 150, 100, or 200 pounds doesn't really make a huge difference to the outcome. What he did say is that with a double knee restraint specifically, it's 2 knees on the person, it has a modest influence on the weight applied to. Now, these are not testing respiration, these were weight tests on dummies. So what he's measuring here is if a person weighs 140 pounds and they kneel on somebody, how much weight are they transferring? With a single knee, it didn't matter what weight the individual was. With a double knee, up to 23% of their body weight could be transferred to the dummy.
Up to, I'm sorry, how much?
23%. So they were not looking. When you see it, it has a modest influence. It has a modest influence on the weight transferred, not respiratory activity.
Okay. Do you know, based on your review of the materials, were you able to ascertain Officer Chauvin's weight?
I was informed, yes, and I've seen that weight.
And what is that?
140 pounds is what I was told.
Now, you also, in reviewing the videos, you see that he has 2 feet on the ground with the exception of one small moment.
Yes, that was what I did actually see in the video.
So what portion of Mr. Chauvin's weight was transferred onto Mr. Floyd's body?
He's using a single knee technique through the greater majority. His other knee is either on the bicep area or on close to the left chest wall. So single knee tech, it's going to be less than 23%. But even if he applied both knees, which he would have transferred 23% of his body weight. For a 140 pound person, that would be between 30 and 35 pounds.
Less than 225 pounds from the
Yes.
laboratory experiment.
Yes.
So in terms of, let me ask you this first. In terms of the placement of Officer Chauvin's, knee to Mr. Floyd, is it your opinion that Mr. Chauvin's knee in any way impacted the structures of Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, it did not. None of the vital structures were in the area where the knee appeared to be from the videos.
Now, again, in terms of your death investigations, you've reviewed photographs, you've reviewed the autopsy photographs, things of that nature, correct?
Yes.
Were any signs of, well, generally speaking, do signs of injury play into your analysis as to the cause of death?
Yes.
How so?
Well, you make an observation of, such as in this particular case, of a knee providing force to a particular part of the body, and then you go and you look at the same part of the body to see whether or not you can find corroborating evidence within the body itself, either an abrasion to the skin, subcutaneous hemorrhage, hemorrhage into the muscles, or other injuries that may be caused by the knee.
And what injuries did you observe in the photographs of Mr. Floyd?
All of his injuries were in areas where the knee was not. In other words, they were on the front of his body, his face, his places where he was restrained, but there was absolutely no evidence of any injury on the skin to the subcutaneous tissue or the deeper structures of the back or the neck.
Were there any broken bones, spinal injuries, anything of that nature?
There were no broken bones documented. I did not see a description of the spinal cord in the autopsy report, but given that there was really no external evidence of the area, the muscles around the spinal column, I would be very surprised if there was any spinal cord injury in this particular case.
So you referenced the back of Mr. Floyd. Did you see any bruising to the skin?
I did not see bruising or abrasion to the skin.
Did you see any bleeding into the subcutaneous tissues of the neck and back?
Not on the autopsy photographs, nor was it documented in the autopsy.
How about to the muscles?
The same.
And so in your opinion, the absence of such injury, how does that speak to the cause of death?
It speaks to the amount of force that was applied to Mr. Floyd was less than enough to bruise him.
So in terms of the knee, can you, I'm looking at your PowerPoint here, can you help us understand how the knee relates to questions of injury and force?
Well, there are two structures that would be of concern in this particular case. One would be the actual knee itself, and the other would be the tibia, which is the shin bone. This diagram shows the shin bone, and this is this object right here. And if you remove that particular red circle that I just put in, you can see that the tibia has a relatively defined front edge right over here. And you can feel it on yourself, but there's a nice ridge all the way down, which is actually quite prominent and hard, and it's right underneath the skin. And so that allows an unforgiving surface such as the shin bone to be placed on soft tissues which are more vulnerable and cause some degree of injury to that area. So that's the shin bone. The knee is actually not that much different. The knee is somewhat spherical. You've got your patella, and you've got the ends of the femur, the thigh bone on either side, and you've got the ends of the tibia just below, all of which are bony prominences, and again right underneath the skin. And they can direct the amount of force. If you put a substantial, 30, 40, 50 pounds worth of force, focus with your knee onto somebody, in my opinion, the chances of a subcutaneous or intramuscular hemorrhage is very, very high.
And you didn't see that in this autopsy?
It was not documented, and it's not visible on the autopsy photographs.
In your career as a forensic pathologist, have you looked at other strangulation type cases?
Yes, strangulation and other restraint situations where knees have been used, yes.
Do you typically see marks in those cases?
In manual strangulation, often you will see hemorrhaging into the muscles of the neck, and in cases where the knee has been used on the back, We often see a bruise consistent, and in times we have matched it to video cam footage of where we see a knee being placed. Yes.
Including just finger marks, I suppose.
Yes, so just the pressure from somebody's fingers is enough to cause muscle hemorrhage in a manual strangulation case. We're not talking about a person putting weight on somebody, we're just talking about somebody squeezing a neck.
When you look at this case and you see the knee is involved, the shin bone is involved, would you expect to see a greater likelihood of bruising from just the fingers?
Objection, Your Honor, call for speculation.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
In this particular case, where the knee is involved, there's allegations of it being used to force or subdue Mr. Floyd, would you expect the knee and shin bone to have a greater likelihood to produce bruising?
Then fingers, yes.
And is there any objective medical findings in the autopsy showing pressure placed to the back?
No.
Now, again, we've talked about hypoxia, and we can take this down now, Judge. We've talked about hypoxia. What are the effects of hypoxia that you would expect to see if that were present?
So there are some observable symptoms when a person becomes hypoxic. Is that what you're asking, Councillor?
Yes.
Yes.
What are those?
So people typically start to get a little confused, disoriented. They may have visual changes. People describe little spots of light, a grey curtain coming down. So there are visual abnormalities that people will describe and complain of. They often become incoherent. They have difficulty in speaking. What is happening with hypoxia is your brain is getting progressively short of oxygen, and so you're getting decreased function of your brain. And some of those are going to mimic intoxication by other sources.
Did Mr. Floyd, based on your review, complain of such visual changes?
No, he complained of shortness of breath, but there was no indication that he made any statements that he was having difficulty in seeing things.
Is shortness of breath one of those things you'd expect to see in hypoxia?
Yes.
What causes that feeling of shortness of breath in a hypoxia situation?
So again, we're looking at hypoxia of the brain, which gives the person the sense that they need to breathe faster, breathe harder, they're short of breath. And that can be caused by inability to get oxygen in or air into the lungs. So an obstruction and or something that interferes with the airway or affects the ability to move the lungs. So it can be respiratory or it can be cardiovascular. And you can get shortness of breath with heart attack, you can get shortness of breath with other vascular abnormalities. So therefore, it's not a good discriminator. It doesn't help you separate out whether or not there was a respiratory problem versus a distribution problem of the oxygen. Because what you're looking at is air coming into the lungs and then the heart distributes it. And so if you have anything which interferes with the distribution of air from outside your body to the absorption through the heart and getting to the brain, all the brain perceives is I haven't got enough oxygen, and you get that sense of I am short of breath.
And does you get that same sensation from cardiac functions?
Yes, I just mentioned that, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. In your review of the videos, did Mr. Floyd appear confused?
He, not to my eye, not confused to time and place and disoriented, no.
Did you observe breathing patterns?
Yes.
How would you estimate his breathing to, what was the rate of his breathing?
I think my estimation was very similar to previous experts, about 20 to 25 breaths per minute.
And if someone is experiencing hypoxia, how would that affect the rate of breathing?
Typically, when you're short of breath, you breathe faster and faster and faster.
And is 22 to 25 breaths per minute considered rapid breathing?
It's faster than being at rest. And typically, I think at rest we would be breathing at less than 20, but it's certainly not a rapid respiratory rate, no.
How about certain types of phobias?
Yes. So, you know, if you have a phobia and you are pushed into a situation where you have to face the phobia, it's very stressful, and it will fire up your fight and flight type situation.
How would that affect the respiratory rate?
Well, the moment you go into fight and flight and your adrenaline is surging, you're likely to start, some people hyperventilate. There are lots of variables there.
So again, in terms of that respiration rate, you would expect it to increase well beyond the normal rate.
Yes, I would not expect it to slow down.
Okay. In terms of the placement of the knee and the neck, could you determine based on your review whether it appeared his airway was obstructed?
Yes, the placement of the knee is towards the back and the back right side of Mr. Floyd's neck, and the airway is around the front. It is nowhere close to his airway.
We were talking about having an open airway. How does that affect your ability to speak?
The ability to speak or make any other sound, groaning, and Mr. Floyd did groan. So any of the sounds that Mr. Floyd is making requires you to be able to take air in over the vocal cords and out over the vocal cords. And so therefore, you cannot make sound unless you're moving air and that your mouth is open and people can actually hear to some extent. I can hum with my mouth closed, but it's not effective. So the bottom line is moving air in and out and speaking and making noise is very good evidence that the airway was not closed.
Now, in terms of, again, prior testimony, did you review or watch the testimony of Dr. Tobin?
I did not watch all of Dr. Tobin's testimony, no.
Okay. Did you hear him discussing the hypopharynx
I did,
and hypopharynx compression?
yes.
Have you ever seen anything in the forensic medical literature that a compression of the hypopharynx can cause asphyxia?
I have not.
When you heard his testimony, what steps and efforts did you take to consider that?
Started to do a survey of the available medical literature to ensure that I hadn't missed something. And I could not find,
Objection, Your Honor. Sidebar.
Overruled. Continue.
I could not find anything in the forensic literature talking about pressure applied to the neck causing a hypopharynx.
Objection, Your Honor. Failure to disclose.
Overruled.
And then I went to the standard medical literature, and there are entities which cause impairment of the hypopharynx, but they are usually, well, they all were focused on foreign bodies being inhaled, such as hot dogs or some other object, and then also tumors in that area potentially blocking off that structure. So nothing that really matched the testimony of Dr. Tobin, as I understand it.
Okay. In terms of hypoxia, moving back to that hypoxia, is hypoxia, the signs of hypoxia, is that a progressive or a fast process?
Typically, it can be both, but you have to recognize that there is oxygen in your blood that is there, and it takes a while to use up that particular oxygen. So in most circumstances, the onset of hypoxia is gradual. If I restrict somebody's breathing and slow it down by some means or stop it by some means, there is still oxygen dissolved in their blood. You can hold your breath for 30 seconds with comfort. At 45 seconds, you're probably getting a little uncomfortable and you want to breathe. That's your innate reflex trying to override your voluntary suppression of your breathing. But you could probably go out to a minute before you start feeling woozy and or uncomfortable and disoriented. And so that is that's the heart continuing to distribute what you've got in your. And so we see hypoxia occurring gradually in most circumstances over time. It's not something which is an on-off switch and rapid.
And as far as those symptoms that you see or would expect to see in a hypoxic situation, do they gradually progress like that as well?
Typically, yes.
Did you notice hypoxic changes in this particular case?
No. Mr. Floyd was coherent and understandable until shortly before there was a sudden cessation of his movement.
So if Mr. Floyd in this case was progressively suffering from hypoxia, what would you have expected to observe?
I would expect him to become disoriented, confused, incoherent. I would expect some of those symptoms to be at least somewhat apparent.
And you would have, in your review of the videos, would you have expected to see a progression in that hypoxia?
Objection, Your Honor, ask and answer that given to.
Sorry, understood. Now, how about asphyxia due to position or compression? Let's talk about that. What does that affect?
So there are certain positions a person can get into which impairs your breathing.
And what does that lead to?
It leads to difficulty in moving your diaphragm and your chest, and impairing your ability to reoxygenate your blood.
Can that lead to hypoxia?
Yes.
Which bodily organ would you expect to see affected first?
The brain.
And all of those effects on speech and orientation and things progressing.
Correct.
But you described what you saw as a sudden change. What does that mean to your analysis?
So Mr. Floyd goes from making clear statements. And some of the words I heard were please, and I'm short of breath, please. And then there's a period of about 45 seconds of silence, but he's still moving and seems to be active. And then there's a sudden relaxation. And so he goes from pretty much fully functional and coherent to unconscious very rapidly.
So in this particular case, how does his 90% blockage of the right coronary artery come into play?
So what you're looking at there is a sudden decompensation, which is much more consistent with a sudden cardiac event. And what happens there is the moment the heart stops pumping sufficient blood, there is no circulation of blood. There is no circulation of the blood that still has some oxygen in it. And the brain will function for about 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds with full consciousness. After that, the person loses consciousness, but is not instantly dead. People don't suddenly stop breathing when they go unconscious. they will continue to breathe for a period of time, which can be as long as a minute or two, until the respiratory center in your brain shuts down. And at that stage, the person stops breathing.
So in this case, can you just kind of describe the layers of factors that lead you to your conclusion that this was a sudden cardiac event?
Yes. So we have a heart that's vulnerable because it's too big. It demands lots of oxygen. It has very narrow vessels. There are certain drugs that are present in his system that put it at risk of an arrhythmia, the methamphetamine. There is another drug, fentanyl, which slows down your breathing, which will lower the oxygen, potentially saturation in your blood. We've got the carbon monoxide, which has the potential to rob some of that additional oxygen carrying capacity. And then we've got vasoconstriction. So there are multiple entities all acting together and adding to each other and taking away from a different part of the ability to get oxygen into his heart. And so at some point, the heart exhausted its reserves of metabolic supply and went into an arrhythmia and then stopped pumping blood effectively.
Now, just a couple more topics to just cover with you, Doctor. You did review in any death investigation, do you review the role that controlled substances play in death?
Yes.
Do you do that on a regular basis?
It's a very important part of a forensic investigation, and most medical examiner's offices will try to get close to 100% toxicology analysis on their cases if suitable specimens are available.
Now, in terms of the toxicology in this case, how would you characterize the role of fentanyl from the standpoint of forensic pathology? Not toxicology, forensic pathology.
So fentanyl is a powerful narcotic. It's about 80 times more powerful than morphine. And the side effects of fentanyl are slowing down the respiration. So that impairs your ability to breathe as fast as you normally would.
Does that result in decreased oxygen saturation?
It would result in decreased air exchange, which would mean decreasing the oxygen in the bloodstream, but also not fully getting rid of the carbon dioxide, the byproducts of our normal metabolism, so slowly increasing carbon dioxide in his bloodstream.
Now, again, within the context of forensic pathology, what does the presence of norfentanyl mean to you?
Norfentanyl is a byproduct of fentanyl. It's a metabolic byproduct. And so in your liver, or in Mr. Floyd's liver, as the fentanyl passed through the liver, it was broken down into norfentanyl, which is the metabolic byproduct. It's the liver beginning to destroy and metabolize the fentanyl and remove it from the body system.
Now, I'm going to, for the court, I have, there are 3 slides contained within your PowerPoint presentation. I've independently marked them as exhibits 1059, 1060, and 1061. I'd like to show them to the witness. Can you see that, Doctor?
Yes.
Would you agree that this appears to be a screenshot taken from the body-worn camera of Officer Lane at 20:09 and 44 seconds?
Correct.
Looking at the second one, would you agree that this, again, appears to be a body-worn camera image taken at 20:09, 45 seconds?
Yes.
And finally, a third image at 20:09 and 48 seconds.
Yes.
All right. I would offer 2059, 2060, and 2061.
No objection, Your Honor.
And received.
Your Honor, permission to publish 1059. So in this image, Doctor, it's kind of hard to see. What, in your review, did you determine whether there was the possibility that controlled substances were ingested at the time of approach by Officers King and Lane?
Yes.
And what do you see in this image, 1059, that is consistent with that?
In the back corner of Mr. Floyd's mouth, you can see what appears to be a white object.
See if I can- Are you talking this object right there? Oops,
Just slightly higher up than that, yes.
I can't. Well, why don't you do it?
Sorry, I covered it with the dot, but that's what I'm referring to.
All right.
You can see it just underneath the dot.
Now, in the next image, 1060, what appears to be happening?
In this particular image, it appears that Mr. Floyd is looking away, away from, excuse me, from Officer Lane.
And looking at the timestamps, that's approximately 1 second later.
Yes.
And in the third image, does he appear to be looking at Officer Lane again?
Yes,
And do you see that same object in his mouth?
I can, yes.
You can. And so what does this lead you to conclude, or what do you strike that? Oops. We could. In terms of the later analysis, there, you understand there was some evidence collected from the backseat of Squad 320?
That is my understanding, yes.
And do you know what that substance was?
There was some material there that had saliva and DNA on it that matched Mr. Floyd, and those, I believe, and those objects had fentanyl and methamphetamine, if my memory serves me correctly.
So is that what you conclude your analysis on in terms of the ingestion of controlled substances as far as the timing in this case? Both before they were approached as well as during, in the backseat of the squad car?
Yes.
Now, how does the depression of the respiratory rate, we may have covered this, I apologize, how does the depression of the respiratory system, how does that affect the heart specifically?
If the respiratory rate is decreased, the amount of oxygen that is getting into the bloodstream through the lungs is decreased. If I breathe slowly, I'm not able to get as much oxygen into my lungs as if I'm breathing very rapidly. So anything which slows down respiration is going to affect the ability to oxygenate your blood.
And will that also work in concert with the coronary artery issues?
It makes it worse. Again, anything which lowers his oxygen saturation in the blood will act again to restrict oxygen supply to his heart muscles past that blockage.
How about you also understand that methamphetamine was found in the toxicology?
Yes.
And how would you look at the role of methamphetamines from the perspective of a forensic pathologist?
So methamphetamine has three major factors. It can cause arrhythmias, it causes vasoconstriction, and it causes the heart to beat faster. Those are its three major physiological or pharmacological activities. And that would impair, again, an individual in Mr. Floyd's condition with his heart disease and put him at risk.
Now, in terms of, again, the toxicology findings, in the fentanyl, there was the metabolite norfentanyl, correct?
Yes.
What does that tell you in terms of the timing of when Mr. Floyd may have ingested the fentanyl?
It tells you at least some of the fentanyl was taken at some point previous, at some time before, that allowed for enough time for the fentanyl to be absorbed and then pass through the liver and some of it to be broken down. That doesn't happen instantaneously. It can take a period of time.
And methamphetamine, does it have a similar metabolite?
It has a metabolite, yes.
And what is the metabolite?
Amphetamine.
And based on your review of the toxicology in the case, was there amphetamine found?
I did not see any amphetamine in the reports.
What does that suggest to you as a forensic pathologist relevant to the time at which Mr. Floyd would have ingested the methamphetamine?
So that would be consistent with a recent ingestion of methamphetamine.
And in terms of the phase of absorption or elimination, where would that place him?
Well, if there's no evidence of elimination, i.e. metabolism from methamphetamine to amphetamine, it's not in the elimination phase. And given that there appears to be, there's none of that, he's still probably in the absorptive phase. It's consistent with the absorptive phase.
And ultimately, those pills that were found in the backseat of the squad car, you understand that when Mr. Floyd was in the squad car, he was handcuffed.
Objection, rephrase. Sustained.
What information did you have about Mr. Floyd's ability to ingest those controlled substances while he was in the squad car?
He had his hands cuffed behind his back from the videos, and those were placed outside when he was taken out of his own vehicle. I did not see any time when those were removed until such time as resuscitation was attempted. So the entire time he had his hands cuffed behind his back. And therefore I cannot think of a plausible way that an individual would be able to get materials into their mouth while restrained in such a format.
Now, the last topic I'd like to discuss with you is the paraganglioma. Did I say that right?
That is close.
All right. Can you just describe what that is?
A paraganglionoma. So this is a tumor that was found at the time of autopsy down in Mr. Floyd's lower abdominal area. And these are tumors. And they typically are of two types. One which is has parasympathetic, or is similar to the parasympathetic part of your nervous system, which does not secrete any substances, or certainly vasoactive substances like catecholamine. And then there are the sympathetic ones, which have the ability to secrete. The parasympathetic ones tend to be found up in the head and neck area, and the sympathetic ones tend to be found down in the lower abdominal area. Again, this is where Mr. Floyd's was found.
What's the relevance of finding the paraganglionoma in this case?
So these tumors have, at least the ones in the pelvic area, if they are secreting vasoactive substances, catecholamines is the correct term, they will cause an individual potentially to be hypertensive. So that's one of their baseline, if they have a low level of secretion. And the other thing that paraganglionomas do is every now and then, without warning, they'll have a sudden surge in secretion, so they're cyclical, which sometimes makes it difficult to diagnose them. You have to do specific testing to diagnose them to get around the cyclical activity.
So just kind of in conclusion, Doctor, did you form ultimately opinions as to the cause and manner of death of Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
And what would those conclusions be?
Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia due to hypertensive atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease during the restraint.
And were there contributing causes?
Yes.
What are those?
The substances, the fentanyl and the methamphetamine, the potential of a carbon monoxide role, and the potential that the paraganglionoma was adding adrenaline to this whole mixture, making things even worse.
How would you classify the manner of death?
So this is one of those cases where you have so many conflicting different manners. The carbon monoxide would usually be classified as an accident, although somebody was holding him there. So some people would say you could elevate that to a homicide. You've got the drugs on board. In most circumstances, in most jurisdictions, a drug intoxication would be considered to be an accident. He's got significant natural disease, certainly the heart. The paraganglionoma, you can certainly consider it as a potential exacerbating process, but I wouldn't put it at the top of the list there. So he's got a mixture of that. And then he's in a situation where he's been restrained in a very stressful situation, and that increased his fight and flight type reaction, and that would, during restraint, would be considered a homicide. And you put all of those together, it's very difficult to say which of those is the most accurate. So I would fall back to undetermined
Now, if we
in
can,
this particular case.
if we put your slide regarding the undetermined manner again back up. So essentially this, Doctor, you would agree that this had lots of or many potential contributing causes.
Correct.
And under the definition, the name's definition of an undetermined manner, how does that apply?
So that is what this classification under the name guidelines is really one of the uses of this particular classification is when you've got so many conflicting different potential mechanisms of death that could lead to so therefore the manner is not clear.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Members of the jury will take our lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 1:30. Council remain for a short time. And Doctor, you may step down.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, be seated. We did have a sidebar regarding one objection by the state regarding certain testimony of this witness, including lack of disclosure. And we had not talked about this earlier. And so I wanted the state to know that in order to meet anything, we have experts who are watching each other's testimony. And this expert testified that he did certain things very close to his testimony. I am allowing the state until tomorrow. I'm not going to make you come up with any rebuttal today. Even if we finish today with the defense case, I would allow the state to consider and call anybody in rebuttal to meet anything because I assume that Dr. Tobin or others might be listening. And so I would give, and that's why I overruled the objection, is because even if it had been disclosed, I would have allowed it and given the state time to respond, and I will give you overnight, so there's not any prejudice to the state if it was not disclosed. That's my reasoning, Your Honor. Or if you're saying, Your Honor, I really didn't get a chance to look at this report, what are you thinking? That's why. I didn't want you to think it was personal. So, Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Nelson, feel free to talk overnight in case there is a way, if there is rebuttal testimony, if we can somehow make that come in easily.
Yes, Your Honor.
Well, we won't get into that. That's your business, not mine. But I will allow you overnight to prepare any rebuttal.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay, thank you. See you at 1:30.